I am Timothy Graves, formerly a surgical dresser at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, now a man who draws the dead because the living are too loud. What I witnessed in the operating theater of 1845 was not merely a medical failure, but a collision between human arrogance and the fragile machinery of the flesh. If you have the stomach to stand witness to the histories buried in the dark, take your place among the congregation of the Ossuary Archives. We keep the lantern lit for those brave enough to look. The operating theater at St. Bartholomew's always smelled of yesterday's pain. It is a specific scent, distinct from the general miasma of London. It is the copper tang of old blood that is soaked into the wooden floorboards, mingled with the sweet cloying rot of gangrene and the sharp bite of vinegar used to wipe the table. We called it the abattoir, though never within earshot of the governors. The floor was strewn with fresh sawdust every morning, a pale yellow carpet designed to drink what fell from the table so the surgeons would not slip in the gore. By noon, that yellow would be a slurry of crimson mud. I was 23, the son of a butcher, which the hospital board deemed sufficient qualification for handling severed limbs. My hands were strong, my stomach iron, and my future, I believed, was bright. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood was the god of this small, terrifying universe. They called him Cornelius the Quick. In an age before the mercy of ether or chloroform, speed was the only kindness a surgeon could offer. A slow surgeon was a murderer. A fast one was a savior, regardless of what he left behind. Blackwood could remove a leg at the thigh in under a minute. He wore his frock coat stiff with the dried fluids of 100 previous patients, a badge of honor, a sign of his prolific experience. We did not wash our hands between cases. To do so was considered an effeminate waste of time when the line of suffering men stretched out the door. I worshipped him. I polished his instruments until they shone like mirrors in the gaslight, unaware that I was sharpening the very thing that would undo me. But the surgeon's hands were shaking before he'd even picked up the scalpel. It was subtle at first, a tremor in the thumb as he buttoned his cuff, a slight rattle when he set his tea saucer down in the surgeon's lounge. I saw it because it was my job to see everything, to anticipate the tool he needed before he asked for it. Dr. Blackwood managed this weakness with a medicinal tonic he kept in a crystal decanter in his office. He called it his nerve soother. I knew it as single malt whiskey, smuggled down from the Highlands. On the morning of Elias Hartwell's surgery, I counted 3 glasses before the sun had fully breached the horizon. He was fortifying himself against the screams, perhaps, or maybe against the crushing pressure of the stopwatch. Elias Hartwell was not like our usual clientele. The workhouse poor, the drunks, the broken laborers, they came to us with a fatalistic resignation. Elias was a man of precision. He was a master horologist, a watchmaker who kept a shop on Clerkenwell Green. He had delayed the operation for 3 months, terrified not of the pain, but of the loss of balance. A man with one leg is like a clock with a bent gear, he had told me when I changed his dressings the day prior. He may tick, Mr. Graves, but he will never keep true time again. His leg was a ruin. It had started as a simple scrape from a rusted iron railing, ignored until the heat rose in the limb. Now, the mortification had set in. The foot was black and bloated, the toes fused into an unrecognizable mass of necrotic tissue. The smell was sweet and nauseating, like rotting lilies. The line of demarcation, where the living flesh met the dead, had crept up past his shin, a jagged red border of inflammation. We wrapped it in cloths, soaked in laudanum and vinegar, but the corruption laughed at our poultices. There was no saving it. The only question was whether Blackwood could cut it off before the poison reached Elias's heart. The date was set for a Tuesday, 6:47 a.m. The light was best then, pouring through the skylight of the theater before the London smog choked the sky gray. I arrived at 5 a.m. to prepare the theater. My duties were specific: check the straps on the table, ensure the sawdust was thickest on the left side where the surgeon stood, and arrange the knives. The knives were long, double-edged Liston blades, designed to slice through muscle in a single sweep. The saw was heavy, its teeth set wide to chew through the femur without binding. I ran my thumb along the flat of the blade, testing the weight. It felt like justice. It felt like science. Dr. Blackwood entered at 6:15. He looked pale, his eyes rimmed with red. "A brisk morning, Graves," he muttered, his voice gravelly. He went straight to the side table where his instruments lay. He didn't look at me. He picked up the tourniquet, a canvas strap with a wooden screw, and twisted it idly. His hands were steady now. The whiskey had done its work, but there was a manic energy to him. He paced the small semicircle of the operating floor, his boots crunching in the fresh sawdust. "We shall set a record today, Timothy," he said, using my Christian name, which he rarely did. "Mr. Liston did a thigh in 28 seconds last month. I intend to do 25. 25 seconds, sir?" I asked, arranging the sponges. "Is that necessary?" He spun on me, his coattails flaring. "Necessary? Pain is a function of time, boy. Every second that man is on the table is a second he is dying of shock. To be slow is to be cruel. We are racing the Reaper, and I intend to win." He laughed, but the sound had no humor in it. It was a brittle cracking sound, like dry wood snapping. He took another swig from a flask he produced from his pocket, a fourth drink. I said nothing. Who was I to question the senior surgeon of St. Bartholomew's? The porters brought Elias in at 6:30. He was pale, sweating from the fever that the leg was pumping into his blood. He was dressed in a nightshirt that had been cut away at the hip. He didn't struggle as they lifted him onto the wooden table, though his breathing was shallow and rapid. The terror in his eyes was absolute. It was the look of a trapped animal that knows the trap has teeth. He clutched something in his hand, his silver pocket watch. "You must hold this," Elias whispered to me as I strapped his chest down. His voice was thin, trembling. "Please, Mr. Graves, don't let them take it. It must be wound. It must be kept safe." I took the watch. It was warm from his feverish grip. "I will keep it safe, Mr. Hartwell," I promised. I placed it on the wooden stool near the instrument tray, facing him so he could see it if he turned his head. The second hand swept around the face with smooth, relentless indifference. Tick, tick, tick. Dr. Hale's case notes from that day contain only one word: mistake. The holders entered next, 4 burly men recruited from the docks. Their job was simple: to be stronger than the pain. They took their positions, one at each shoulder, one at the good leg, and one ready to sit across the patient's abdomen if he thrashed too violently. Elias looked up at the skylight, murmuring the Lord's Prayer. Dr. Blackwood rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that were thick with muscle and scarred from years of slips and scratches. He took the long amputation knife in his right hand. He nodded to me. "Tourniquet," Blackwood commanded. I stepped forward, sliding the canvas loop up Elias's thigh, high into the groin, twisting the wooden screw until the flesh bunched and the flow of blood to the rotting limb was choked off. Elias gasped, a sharp intake of breath that whistled through his teeth. "Time me, gentlemen," Blackwood announced to the gallery of students who had gathered in the tiered seats above. They leaned forward, pocket watches in hand, a flock of vultures in tweed. Blackwood positioned his feet in the sawdust. He looked at the leg, then at me. "Ready the catch, Graves." I moved to my position, standing just below the knee, ready to catch the severed limb the moment the saw passed through, so it wouldn't drop and tear the remaining skin flap. I was inches from the blade. I could smell the whiskey on Blackwood's breath over the stench of the gangrene. "Proceed," Blackwood whispered. And the ticking of the watch seemed to stop, drowned out by the sudden terrible silence of the intake of breath before the scream. The first cut is not a sound, it is a temperature. It is the sudden, searing heat of life breaching the barrier of skin, spilling out into the cold air of the theater. Dr. Blackwood moved with a violence that masqueraded as grace. He did not slice, he swept. The long Liston knife, a glimmer of Sheffield steel, plunged into the soft flesh of Elias's thigh, just above the tourniquet. There was a wet tearing noise, like canvas ripping underwater. For a fraction of a second, there was no blood, only the gaping white mouth of the fat and the dark red meat of the quadriceps. Then, the heart pumped. A curtain of crimson erupted. It defied the tourniquet, splashing across Blackwood's white apron in a diagonal slash, peppering my face with hot, iron-tasting droplets. I did not blink. I could not. My job was to hold the rotting limb steady, to provide the countertraction so the knife would not snag. I gripped the ankle, my fingers sinking into the edematous, doughy flesh of the calf. The skin sloughed off under my gloves, slippery and foul. Elias did not scream immediately. The shock robbed him of breath. His mouth opened, a perfect black circle of agony, his eyes bulging until the whites were visible all around the irises. The holders grunted, leaning their full weight onto him. The table creaked, a wooden groan that harmonized with the wet slap of the surgeon's movements. Then the sound came, a high, thin keen that rose rapidly into a shriek so primal it vibrated in the fillings of my teeth. It was the sound of a soul trying to escape a body that had become a torture chamber. "Time!" Blackwood roared, tossing the bloody knife to the floor. It clattered against the board, sliding into the muck. He didn't wait for a fresh one. He snatched the saw from the table without looking, his eyes fixed on the exposed femur. I remember the texture more than anything. The restraints were soft leather, almost gentle. They had to be. Patients fought so hard they broke their own bones against the wood. I saw Elias's good leg kicking wildly, his heel drumming a frantic tattoo against the table leg. The holders were sweating, their knuckles white. "Hold him, damn you!" Blackwood spat, bringing the saw blade down into the trench of severed muscle. He began to saw. This is the sound that haunts the nightmares of every man who has stood in an operating theater. It is not a clean sound. It is a hollow, grinding rasp, a vibration that travels up your arms and settles in your chest. Rurch, rurch. The teeth bit into the calcium, throwing up a fine white dust that mixed with the blood to form a pink paste on the blade. 12 seconds! A student shouted from the gallery. The voice was excited, breathless. They were watching a sport. They were betting on a race where the finish line was a man's life. But that's when I noticed the patient's eyes were open during the entire procedure. They weren't looking at the ceiling anymore. They were locked on me. Elias was looking directly at me as I held his dying leg. In the midst of his thrashing, in the absolute center of his hell, he found me. His eyes were filled with a terrible, accusatory clarity. "You promised," they seemed to say. "You are part of this machine." The watch on the stool ticked on. Tick, tick, tick. 13 seconds. 14. Blackwood was manic now. The whiskey had stripped away his caution. He was sawing too fast, the blade heating up from the friction. He was jerking the handle back and forth with a frenzy that shook the patient's entire body. "Come off, you bastard!" he snarled at the bone. He wasn't a doctor anymore. He was a butcher fighting a carcass. "Steady, sir!" I cried out, my voice lost in the cacophony. The leg was heavy in my hands, a dead weight that pulled at my shoulders. I had to adjust my grip. I moved my left hand up, closer to the cut, trying to stabilize the femur so the saw wouldn't bind. It was a standard maneuver. I had done it a dozen times. 15 seconds! Blackwood gave a mighty heave. The saw had cut through the bone, but a splinter remained connected. Instead of using the bone nippers to clip it, he twisted the saw, using the blade as a lever to snap the femur. It cracked with the sound of a pistol shot. The limb came free in my hands. But Blackwood didn't stop. He was moving on momentum, on the muscle memory of speed. As the leg detached, his arm swung wild, the heavy serrated blade continuing its arc. He didn't see my hand. He didn't see the shift in position I had made to catch the falling limb. I didn't feel pain. Not yet. I felt a strange, dull impact, like being struck on the knuckles with a wooden ruler. A cold wind seemed to blow across my fingers. I looked down. I was holding Elias's leg. It was severed, heavy and grotesque, and lying in the sawdust, nestled against the black gangrenous foot of the patient, were two smaller shapes. They were pale, save for the red stumps at their base. They looked like white worms curled in the bloody dust. It took my brain a full second to understand the geometry of what I was seeing. That is the index finger of a left hand. That is the middle finger of a left hand. I looked at my own left hand. It ended in a flat red plain of sheared bone and gushing arteries where my fingers used to be. The blood pumped out in bright rhythmic jets, keeping time with my racing heart. "Done!" Blackwood shouted, throwing his hands up in triumph. "Time? 24 seconds, sir," the student called out, though his voice wavered. The room went silent. The cheering stopped. The scratching of pens and notebooks ceased. The only sound was the wet drip, drip, drip of my own blood hitting the floorboards. Blackwood looked at me. His eyes widened. The triumph drained from his face, replaced by a gray, hollow horror. He looked from my ruined hand to the sawdust, then back to his saw. "Graves?" he whispered. The name hung in the air, a question he didn't want answered. I dropped the leg. It hit the floor with a wet thud. I stared at my hand. The pain arrived then, a white-hot lightning bolt that shot up my arm and exploded in my skull. I fell to my knees, cradling the stump against my chest. "The watch," I gasped. It was the only thought my mind could latch onto, the logic of the shock. I have to wind the watch. That's when I noticed the silence was too absolute. The screaming had stopped, not tapered off, but cut. I looked up from the floor. Elias Hartwell lay motionless on the table. His head was turned to the side, facing the stool where his watch sat. His eyes were still open, still fixed on the spot where I had been standing. But the light behind them was gone. The pupils were fixed, dilated, staring into the abyss. Dr. Hale's case notes from that day contain only one word: mistake. But looking at Elias, I knew it wasn't a mistake. It was a transaction. The speed had been purchased and the price was everything. "He's gone," the anesthetist muttered, his fingers on Elias's neck. "Heart failure." The shock. Blackwood stood frozen. He was holding the saw, the blood dripping from its teeth. He looked at the dead patient. He looked at me, bleeding into the sawdust. He looked at the gallery of students who were now staring down in mute horror. 24 seconds, Blackwood whispered. He sounded like a child who had broken a toy. "I did it in 24 seconds. I began to laugh. It was a bubbling, hysterical sound that rose from my throat without my permission. I laughed because the watch was still ticking. The little silver machine didn't care. It measured the seconds of the surgery, and now it measured the seconds of the death, and it measured the seconds of my maiming with the same cold, mechanical indifference. The room began to spin. The gaslights elongated into streaks of fire. The smell of the gangrene and the blood and the whiskey merged into a suffocating cloud. I saw Timothy Graves, the aspiring surgeon, dissolving. In his place was a cripple, a man who would never hold a scalpel, a man who had given his flesh to the god of speed and received nothing in return. Blackwood dropped the saw. It clattered loudly, a final gavel bang closing the session. He walked out of the theater without a word, leaving the dead man on the table and the maimed boy on the floor. The darkness that took me was not sleep. It was a mercy. The first thing I realized when I woke was that I was no longer a healer. I was meat. I lay in the recovery ward of St. Bartholomew's, a long, whitewashed tunnel of misery where the air hung heavy with the smell of hospitalism, that distinct, sickly sweet perfume of rotting flesh and carbolic acid that signaled the presence of the unseen killer we now know as sepsis. But in 1845, we called it bad air. We believed the danger floated in the miasma, rising from the Thames fog, not on the unwashed hands of the surgeons who moved from the autopsy table to the bedside. I was placed in a bed next to a window, a privilege usually reserved for those expected to die before sunrise. My left arm was a heavy, throbbing stone bound in linen. I did not look at it. I looked at the ceiling, tracing the water stains that looked like maps of countries that didn't exist. The pain was not sharp anymore. It was a deep, rhythmic thudding, synchronized with my heartbeat, as if my body was trying to pump blood into fingers that were currently rotting in a sawdust bin 2 floors below. "Mr. Graves." It was Mrs. Higgins, the night matron. She was a formidable woman with forearms like hams and a face that had seen enough death to be bored by it. She held a cup of beef tea. "You're awake? Dr. Blackwood said you wouldn't be." "The patient," I croaked. My throat felt like it was filled with glass shards. "Mr. Hartwell, the watchmaker." Mrs. Higgins didn't blink. She set the tea on the bedside table, her movements practiced and efficient. "Passed an hour ago. Never woke up from the shock. They've already moved him to the dead house. One death." "And the surgery?" I asked, needing to know if the speed had meant anything, if the sacrifice of my hand had purchased a record, a legacy, anything other than silence. She paused, smoothing her apron. A shadow crossed her face. There was a commotion in the gallery. One of the governors, Lord Fenwick. He was sitting in the front row, right above the table. She lowered her voice, leaning in closer as if sharing a state secret. When the accident happened, the spray, it covered him. He stood up to shout, clutched his waistcoat, and fell stone dead over the railing. Heart failure, they say. Or perhaps the sheer horror simply stopped him mid-breath. 2 deaths. I closed my eyes. The mathematics of the morning were grim. 24 seconds of surgery, 2 corpses, and me. But the surgeon's hands were shaking before he'd even picked up the scalpel. The memory replayed in my feverish mind, but now it was different. I saw the aftermath. I saw the ripples spreading out from that single hasty cut. For 3 days, I lived in the twilight kingdom of fever. This is the part of medical history the textbooks gloss over. They speak of complications. They do not speak of the dreams. When the infection, erysipelas, the St. Anthony's fire, took hold of my stump, I hallucinated that I was a clock. I could feel gears grinding in my chest. I could feel the mainspring winding tighter and tighter in my head. Elias Hartwell was there, standing at the foot of my bed, but he had 3 legs and he was asking me for the time. "It is 24 seconds past death," I told him. On the 4th day, the fever broke. I woke to find Dr. Cornelius Blackwood sitting in the chair where Mrs. Higgins had been. He looked like a ruin of a man. His frock coat was unbuttoned, his cravat loose. He hadn't shaved, and the gray stubble on his chin made him look 10 years older. He was holding a bottle, not bothering to hide it from the passing nurses. "They are calling it a triumph," Blackwood said softly. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the floorboards. "The board. They are calling it the fastest amputation in the history of the hospital. They are ignoring the collateral damage." "Lord Fenwick?" I asked. "Buried yesterday." Blackwood took a pull from the bottle. "And Hartwell went to the pauper's grave. No family to claim him." He finally looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming in a yellow sea of jaundice and regret. "I am sorry, Timothy. I was racing the wrong thing. I thought I was fighting death, but I was just fighting the clock." I looked at my bandaged arm. "Will I lose the elbow?" "No," he said. "The laudable pus is formed. You will live." He laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You will live to draw pictures of what we do. You always had a better eye for anatomy than a stomach for it." He stood up, swaying slightly. "I am resigning, Graves. I cannot hear the ticking anymore. Every time I pick up a knife, I hear that damned watch." Blackwood left St. Bartholomew's that afternoon. He never performed surgery again. Rumors followed him, that he went to the country, that he drank himself into a stupor, that he tried to become a clockmaker but destroyed every timepiece he touched. 6 months later, we received word that he had been found in a boarding house in Shoreditch. The landlady said he hadn't left his room in a week. When they forced the door, they found him sitting in his armchair, cold and still. The room was silent. On the table beside him was an empty phial of laudanum, the sleep that knows no waking. He had not used a blade. He had simply decided to stop his own time, unable to bear the ticking any longer. Beside the empty bottle, he had scrawled a note on the back of an old surgical roster. Just a series of numbers, written over and over until the ink tore the paper. 24, 24, 24. 3 deaths. The legend of that day grew. The students whispered about the 28-second amputation that killed 3 people. They got the time wrong. It was 24, but the count was correct. Elias Hartwell, the patient, Lord Fenwick, the spectator, and Cornelius Blackwood, the surgeon. I was the only survivor of that red circle, and I was not whole. I left the hospital a month later. I could no longer be a dresser. A one-handed surgeon is a liability, and the trauma of the theater made my remaining hand shake too violently for the blade. But Blackwood was right. I could draw. I found work with the anatomists, the men who dissected the bodies provided by the resurrection men. They needed accurate sketches for the medical textbooks. I sat in the cold stone basements, the smell of formaldehyde replacing the smell of sawdust. I drew muscles, nerves, organs. I drew the machinery of life after the life had fled. I drew with a strange, frantic energy, using my right hand, while my left arm ended in a smooth, rounded stump that ached whenever it rained. I drew to understand how we are built, how easily we are unmade. I found a strange peace in the silence of the dead. They did not scream. They did not bleed. They simply waited to be understood. Years have passed. I'm an old man now. The era of speed is over. We have chloroform now, and ether. Surgeons wash their hands. They move slowly, deliberately. The screaming has stopped. The operating theaters are quiet, sterile places of white tile and silence. It is better, undoubtedly. It is progress. But sometimes, when I walk past a watchmaker's shop and hear the collective ticking of 100 clocks, I am back there. I am 23 years old. The sawdust is fresh and yellow. The knife is a blur of silver. I still have Elias Hartwell's watch. I never found anyone to give it to. It sits on my mantle under a glass bell. I wind it every morning. It is a precise, beautiful machine. It does not care about pain. It does not care about blood. It simply measures the time it takes for us to die. I look at my drawings. The flayed skin, the exposed bone. They are my confession. Science climbs a mountain of corpses to see the future. I was just one of the bodies it stepped on. Only I made the mistake of not dying. The scaler is cold, but the history is colder. We are the Ossuary Archives. We remember the bones you forgot.